Our next presenter is Brian Stucky. When people hear his name, people immediately think about such port as MISMO. This is a famous standard for mortgages, for mortgage industry. And this is true because Brian, for many, many years, is initiator and chairman of the standardization movements for mortgage industry. And is he not only expert in this area, and he worked for many years for different federal agencies, but he is applying the latest advances in decision intelligence, and in particular in DMN standard, to MISMO standard, to real mortgage applications, and he has a lot of information to share with us. And if you remember, it was several discussions during last few days about executable regulations. And Brian is going to contribute to DMN regulations that could be executable and could be defined on legal level or any other level. So that could be quite interesting point of view. Brian, please go ahead.
Jacob, thank you very much for the kind words. Great to be here this afternoon, or afternoon for the East Coast of the U.S. Your mileage may vary wherever you're situated, but it's also been great to see a lot of familiar faces and hear a lot of familiar voices from days gone by. Hopefully we'll all be able to be together sooner than later in this. I was just looking back at the history of DecisionCAMP, and I think I was at the first one when it was officially rebranded to DecisionCAMP in San Jose at eBay. So it's been great to be involved with this for well over a decade now. As Jacob said, my focus probably the last 25 years has really been in the mortgage domain here in the US. I do have an AI background from days gone by that pops up every so often, and that served me well. Most recently, I was at Rocket Mortgage, where I ended up leading a group around responsible AI and model governance. And here and there, we found the opportunities where BPMN and DMN can certainly play a role, and that's the reason why you'll see some of what you do in here today. As Jacob mentioned, this is really trying to look again at what it would take to be able to present regulations in DMN. And this is a topic that has come up in the past, and it's been coming up again. And I think, we're living in a time now when regulations are gotten even more complex. They've gotten more frequent. They're more consequential. They've always been in the mortgage industry. They've been in and around consumer protection. Now they're around AI. And you've got this, tricky little problem in that all kinds of different people have to be able to read, interpret, and understand regulations. You've got compliance officers, a legal team, your IT staff, your executive level of a company, and everybody's looking at this in a very different way. And so having a standardized approach for it can be very, very interesting. Jacob mentioned my affiliation with MISMO. I know some of you, especially outside the US, and even within it, may not be familiar with it. It is a group that's part of the Mortgage Bankers Association. MISMO stands for the Mortgage Industry Standards and Maintenance Organization. They initially got together to create a data standard for loans and said, listen, we've got to be able to have people in this industry exchange things. It wasn't that long ago, say around 25 years or so, there were 4 or 5 different formats for loan applications, and those got represented in different ways and passed around, and nothing really matched up well. MISMO created this data standard. Today there is a single loan application, the Universal Residential Loan Application. Any lender selling a loan back to the GSEs, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, has to use a MISMO format. So this really is the language of the mortgage industry. With that in place, they started to expand and say, what are other areas that we can look at to facilitate communication between our membership? And one of the ones that came up early on was around rules. Business rules and business rule management systems have been a wonderful fit and prevalent in the mortgage industry for a long time. I think the first documented case I can recall was Countrywide Mortgage with a system called CLUES, Countrywide Loan Underwriting Expert System in 1993. You will probably not find any size lender or player in the mortgage industry that doesn't have at least one rule application. Most written, I'm not sure what word we're using now. Are they legacy rule platforms or classic business rule platforms? But they're all over the place. And a group started up called BREW, which was a great acronym, the Business Rule Exchange Work Group, to say, how can we exchange rules? And the answer was not really easily, because those classic systems had proprietary languages. DMN ended up being an answer for us. We did a lot of vetting, we did a lot of case studies, and in 2019, it was rolled out as an official MISMO standard, which was very exciting to do. The key here is that we could take the entire MISMO data standard with DMN, so one can write decisions and write rules using that loan standard. So this should be in Notion something that is completely shareable. So I look back and at DecisionCAMP in 2018, which I believe was Luxembourg, and I had this blue slide here at the top that's like, hey, wouldn't this be cool to deploy regulations or rules or whatever you needed to send out across all the industry players? Just send them rule files, set it up as services. We've got a great opportunity here to go out and do some amazing things with it. And I've relayed this story a number of times. MISMO had created I apologize for the number of acronyms in MISMO or in the mortgage industry. I'll do my best to spell them all out. The Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, CFPB, had issued a regulation after 2008 that was a reporting regulation for all lenders to be done annually, called the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. And you have to basically send in what happened for every loan application you got. Approvals, denials, ones that were ID'd as being potential fraud. It's an onerous process. There's about 120 data elements. MISMO, a different group, had built a toolkit. We looked at it and said, wow, I bet you could make this DMN, which you can. Some is a straightforward, take this field and put it in here, and others have some logic
sorry
around
to
it.
interrupt you.
Yep.
You're thinking that you're moving slides. We can see only first slide.
What slide are you showing?
Only first one. So you need to manually select them.
Oh, does it?
Screen what you share is not what we see.
Okay.
It's okay, just move manually on the left. Select slides on the left. No?
Yeah, let's see if that's gonna, did that change?
Not yet. Maybe you should share different screen.
Wow, okay. Let me, sorry about.
It's okay, take your time.
Wonder why.
Just when you share, there is a choice of screens, and you can select that what you want.
Yeah, I'm going to get out of. And.
Okay, now we can see story
2018,
2025.
We're just gonna do it the old-fashioned way here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go.
Yeah, so I was discussing CFPB and the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act and reporting. We wrote a DMN model for it that worked very well, because this was a very difficult task for especially smaller lenders. and got a meeting with CFPB and said, wouldn't it be great if you just distributed this decision model or set it up as a service or certified a company or companies and say, if you submit via this, it's going to be a good reporting measure. And I should have probably taken the hint that because there were more lawyers than tech people in the room, that it might not go the way I wanted. But the words came out from a lawyer ultimately who said, we write the rule, we don't interpret the rule. And I had to pause for a moment, and I said, so if somebody submits their report, you will evaluate it to see if it's correct. Is that right? They said, yes. And I said, and if it's incorrect, you will send it back. And they said, yes. I said, well, how is this different? And then they paused and said, we write the rule, we don't interpret the rule. Meaning lawyers, legal people like to have ambiguity and wiggle room to go through and do as they want, not necessarily agree to a deterministic, certified, this is what it's going to be. So not surprising in some ways, but surprising in many others. This came around again in MISMO this January, and we had some attendees from FHA, Federal Housing Administration, and not speaking directly to the decision modeling group, but generally, and said, well, we came to MISMO because we'd really like to investigate sending out our memos, our regulations as something executable. What do we do? And of course, we got very excited immediately and said, let's talk. And so that really inspired where we went here with this presentation. And to take a look at this again. So, we'll look at why DMN can be used, and I think there's a lot of good reasons why that makes sense. The difficulties, of which there are many. We'll look at the FHA example that spurred them on. We'll also look at the state of Colorado AI regulation bill. In sort of my newer life, looking around at responsible AI, I've been very interested in how some of these things may be able to be automated in some fashion. And then, where we go from there. Well, why DMN? It's, all the things we're talking about for years early on with it, right? Clarity and transparency. This is something that can be consumed by a wide variety of different people. Standardization, traceability, and auditability. It's pretty clear on it. It's definitely not a black box to be able to take a look and see what happened and why it happened. Automation and efficiency, collaboration and communication. All good reasons to go with this route with it. One of the things, specifically when we look at it for regulations, obviously it's an executable way for the logic, the standard language. I mentioned that it bridges the gap between legal text and operational systems with an asterisk, because that's not always the case. And that CFPB example was a prime study in that. Supports automation with traceability, get a fast adoption and agile response to requirements. At another previous DecisionCAMP, I think maybe in Italy, we gave another example that came out of MISMO, where we looked at what's called the ATRQM rule, ability to repay qualified mortgage. Doesn't matter so much what that is. What matters is that was distributed in hundreds and hundreds, literally, of pages of text in the Federal Register. We built a decision model for it that could be done in a single, DRD page, and it was a busy page, but that logic got there. And when people first saw that, they'd say, wow, that's a lot of spaghetti. I'm not sure I can understand it. But when they sat down, they could see, oh, so whatever you compute there then is used in that next computation. And then that decision with this other one here feeds what you need up here. Oh, I get it. It was a much more digestible way for people to see, break apart, and understand what that meant, and was executable. And we had the benefit that, coincidentally, the summer we worked on it, a proposed change to that rule came out, which only took up 15 pages. Within a half a day, we had digested it. We had identified the change that would be required in the model, made the change, tested, and then were able to evaluate the impact of doing so. So that agile response to these things coming out is just absolutely critical. And so, again, excited about the potential for it. Difficulties. Well, we've got more than a few. You can have an oversimplification of what are sometimes some very nuanced rules. And if you just try to take it at top level and assume it's a straightforward kind of a thing. Maintenance can be a plus or minus here. I would argue, although I put it in as a hurdle, that the maintenance challenge, if you're in DMN, and is going to be a lot simpler if you're, as opposed to using a different kind of a system, if in fact you've got to use a system to implement the regulation. We have a lot of ambiguity in legal language, and we'll talk about plenty of examples with that. There may be cases where some of this is going to be an integration challenge with legacy systems, and it's kind of unclear about the risk of misrepresentation and what's consequences if something is coded incorrectly on one side or the other, sort of the way that with the AI regulations now we look at developers and deployers of system and what that means. So I'll preview the two case studies here. The first one was the one that kind of generated this thought again, and from HUD, FHA. It's actually a really good thing they're trying to do here, but it's a way to count rental income on a subject property as part of a mortgage application. And so, they're saying we're going to ensure FHA underwriting guidelines effectively serve the needs of borrowers and expand access to credit, especially those most affected by evolving dynamics of the housing market. They have great intent here, doing a wonderful thing. Very happy to see this happening. And within it, we've got a lot of things that are pretty amenable at first glance to DMN. Some of this is checkbox. Is there evidence of a rental income for at least 9 of the most recent months? Is the borrower's address the same as the borrower's address? Here's a calculation we're going to use for the rental income. Here's the way we're going, the rental income from borrowers cannot exceed 30%. So they're kind of very straightforward, crisp requirements that any of us that worked with DMN in any number of industries, we're going to be reading this and, in your head already, you can see how to build this out. Terrific. On the other side of the coin, the Colorado AI bill. I know we have a lot of international people, and the U.S. is fragmented, to say the least. A number of states have tried to do various things and address various pieces and aspects of it. A lot of times it's wrapped up with data privacy laws. It was about a year ago. I live in Virginia. Found out Virginia is one of 6 states where I can opt out of having my data used to train an AI model. Didn't know it. Wouldn't know how I go about doing it. I'm guessing nobody else really does, but it's in there. But this opening paragraph here, I just found super interesting if you go through it. So developers of a high-risk AI system have got to use reasonable care to protect consumers from any known or reasonably foreseeable risks of discrimination in the system. And so right away, reasonable care, reasonably foreseeable risks, a high-risk system. They use a consequential decision throughout here, and algorithmic discrimination. These are not at all crisp and not at all something that's easy to write down a formula to say, that's what I define as this is going to be. This is very squishy, and I think probably for a number of different reasons. Some of these we will go through and we will find a better definition. So here they have a very clear-cut explanation of algorithmic discrimination. They reference federal laws that are essentially in place for protected classes, that there must not be an unlawful differential treatment. So, okay, now we've got a sense to a point of what this means. And having, in my life around responsible AI, I read probably every proposed state regulation and things that have come out at the federal level. I constantly circle things like that. You will find all over the place where they have used words like make sure it's fair, or make sure it's unbiased, or make sure it doesn't discriminate without telling you what that means. Well, is there a number associated with that? Are there tools that are approved to use to get to that number for those things? The definitions even of what they cover have been all over the place. Remember, one of the early California bills had a global definition for an automated decision system, which, as I read it, could have included stoplights. So there's a lot of things in here and have been that are just incredibly difficult. So let's take a look again at mortgage, or at the FHA study. For the heck of it, I use these terms of hard edges and soft edges. So a hard edge for something is where you've got a clear numeric threshold, something very well defined, clear cut, ambiguous, for a calculation. Soft edges are other things where you just need to show that something exists, or you've got a vague notion of an exception, or perhaps a reference to another piece of guidance or an external guide. So again, not terribly clear cut for it. And we have plenty of examples in this thing for the hard edges. Credit score greater than this, LTV less than this, DTI here, border income is less than 30% of effective income. All right, great, no problem. We can roll right through those with ease. Soft edges, though, you've got these things like manual underwriting decisions, because there was a point in time when an automated decision, if it comes up bad, has to go outside to a human to go through and do a check. So you're already outside of the scope of DMN then. Sufficiency of documentation. What do you need to keep or produce or show? Exceptions for systems. The narrative intent of the policy, which is an interesting one. So in detail for narrative intent, well, we just saw this FHA bill. They want to encourage lenders to support underserved borrowers. That's the umbrella for everything. You don't necessarily have to show that you're doing it, but it might influence some of the things within it. It's directional, but not a strict rule. The discretionary underwriting, there's a place where you definitely have to call out to a human if certain factors have happened. Qualitative criteria, non-numeric narrative factors. A borrower must demonstrate willingness to repay debt. I love that one. They're all very happy to tell you that they're going to do that. Stability of employment is something that can be measured a little bit better, but you've got things that are really just all over the place. Some of the exceptions, forbearance rules can be granted in response to certain emergencies. So exceptions that have to be handled in there. Other exceptions, we've seen a lot of things come in to help out lenders in emergencies. We saw it with COVID, the LA fires, the floods in Texas, hurricanes annually, any kind of thing like that. They will waive, they will pause, they will postpone, they'll do a number of things within to handle. There's a lot of cross-reference guidance. This may cross-reference to a HUD handbook or something that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac do, and they may be changing those on the spot as well. So keeping that up to date and handled correctly is a struggle. Documentation standards. How do you document compliance? What are you going to have to report on later? Enforcement discretion. There are nuances there where by the letter of the law, or you think you have it, maybe you haven't followed as closely as you think. So again, this one, there's a good part of this FHA rule that really fits in very nicely. Rental history greater than 9 months, required documentation is present. You do your calculation. There's the cap rule. You've got an escalation if you need to. So you've got a DMN for a lot of the structure in here. A human review for judgment when you need it. Again, these things kind of play out very nicely for a good part of this. So a good chunk of this, I think, is going to manifest itself very nicely in an executable DMN. One that has pieces that are going to be able to be modified fairly easily if that maintenance is required, but a pretty straightforward, understandable, distributable kind of thing to go through and send out. And this gives us a lot of benefits. This should largely give us, for the pieces we have in here, a uniform application across lenders, faster compliance when we get memos or stipulations or regulations that come out from the government. Clear audit trail, if you follow this closely, that should be at that point largely without question. And again, the point I mentioned earlier, here, the industry data standard is absolutely critical because everybody now is on the same MISMO data standard. When we're talking about these particular pieces in here, we're all talking about the same thing. They can be put in those decisions, and this puts us in pretty good shape. On the other side of the coin, we have the Colorado bill. This one has been really a lot of people think this is going to be a landmark is a strong word, but the one on which a lot of other states end up basing their AI regulations, and it may trickle back further than that. So this one gets pointed to quite a bit. Again, it requires developers, employers of high-risk AI to exercise reasonable care. The hard edges is a smaller set of things here. And even then, they aren't sort of the straightforward calculations. A 90-day reporting deadline triggers for annual reviews, disclosure triggers, and then you've got all these squishy parts of it. What's reasonable care? What's a foreseeable risk? What is discrimination? How much discretion does a particular state attorney general have over this? What is a consequential decision? Nathaniel, I thought at the end, was spot on in his last talk. You got to look at the outcomes, and a lot of this is kind of focused on that, which I think is the way to go with it. But what does that mean if you are trying to build something out? I think that the actual DMN friendly pieces of this are going to be small. Some governance around the soft edges are going to be required, and it's really going to be a nicely hybrid system when all is said and done with it. And at Rocket Mortgage with Responsible AI, I had our team literally build out a business process model that would show the flow of what needed to happen to review a model based on a certain set of regulations that we knew we had to adhere to, because in that way we can identify the process steps that had to be done, what needed to be done for each of those steps, what had to be collected for it, and the players that were involved at each of those steps. And we had a few DMN pieces. There was a model in there that would assess risk, a DMN model to assess risk of the AI model on a 1 to 5 score. And you could collect all of those things. So that worked out very nicely. And I got to teach people on the team what BPMN was, well, in DMN for that matter. So that was a good experiment all around. These hard edges here, as an example, if a credit union deploys an AI loan eligibility model, there's an obligation check. Is this, it's this kind of a model. We have put this in the category of being a high risk system. It's a consequential type of decision. We must do these 3 things. For a consumer rights table, if the borrower is denied, there's a number of actions that need to be triggered off that are going to be happening from it. And for a governance dashboard, flags and things that will pop up to say, this has to happen now, give this information out at this point in time. So again, more business processy in some ways, some decisioning in there here and there with it. Again, I think a lot of the determination in my mind that goes into the type of model and the assessment of risk is something that can fit pretty nicely to DMN, because I certainly want that to be a deterministic assessment every time. And that's a personal opinion. I find that one working fairly well. But we do start to get an effort where we can throw in all kinds of good stuff here for doing this now. So we've got some structured executable rules with thresholds and clocks and triggers. BPMN to orchestrate the tasks that have to go through it, and that's similar to what we did at Rocket. Standard operating procedures that are at least going to operate and give us consistency for things like reasonableness. Fairness testing. We haven't, or people don't talk so much about the link to be able to get PMML from DMN, but we had a whole a set of work packages that would run fairness checks on models, which you could call out to from the DMN, and depending on what those found, and then certainly we had it in our business process. There was a certain level where we could say we're good to go. We don't need to have legal in it. There was another level where we had to have legal give us a thumbs up or thumbs down. And there was a point where we were like, this is bad. This is going back. We have a real issue with it. Templates and checklists for consumer notices, controls mappings, if they're using a NIST standard, whatever it might be, to prevent or to present the affirmative defense. I was constantly asking the legal department what is necessary and sufficient for us to keep to show to a regulator. We need to know, because we can tailor these kinds of things in this flow to ensure we're getting it all there, because that is really the critical answer. I started to go down a really interesting rabbit hole and almost called Jacob to say I was going to redo and rethink the topic of this. And it's something that I've been working on since I did this deck here. But this is really starting to take apart all the categories of hard and soft edges, why DMN is good or bad, and then handling patterns that can be used for them. So this is really one that's just for those squishy areas, and in particular for the Colorado AI law. So, thing like reasonable care, DMN, why does it struggle? Well, it's kind of context dependent. This is something that's probably going to require a policy, a standard operating procedure, whatever you need to have for an evidence pack. A reasonable, foreseeable risk. Well, you've got to go through and create something. We had a bias taxonomy that we calculated over a bunch of factors that were relevant to our industry and our business that was used as part of everything else. Algorithmic discrimination. Well, you're probably going to you might have a machine learning model. You might have some external code that gets called from DMN, but you've got to do some things that probably aren't going to lend themselves to a DMN kind of approach. And so on here. There are ways to attack all of these as part of the bigger picture. And then being able to take them apart in this sense can start to be a useful way to quickly see what's necessary and where you need to get. So, we're looking, let's think of DMN, BPMN, machine learning. There are some policy as code systems. I haven't looked at these much. OPA that's got Rego, which is supposed to be a way to automate policy. What I saw, I wasn't overly thrilled with. Feature flags in order to manage this. Gateways is part of the process that are going to force human judgment. It can both be a gateway or something determined by DMN. But again, you're just kind of structuring this flow to go where you need it and get it to the right people when you do. I was surprised at how much of our approach we're taking a few years back here ended up kind of mapping over here to this kind of a thing. The standard operating procedures, I haven't seen these things done a lot at companies that are developing AI. I think the EU AI Act, since they have so much that's based on the determined risk of a model to show what happens, has kind of looked at this. I think you can tailor these industry to industry. My comment was always, well, in our domain in the mortgage world, we're not going to kill anybody, but we have high risk systems, and we have things we definitely should not do. I don't want to ever come up, and although some will argue that a credit score is in fact social scoring to assess a person's worthiness of credit, but going beyond that line, you have to wonder. I have seen things, and this is where I believe, going back to Nathaniel's talk again, that there are things that are technically legal, but ethically, I would question whether you would want to do them. You know, would you want to go tell your neighbor that, hey, my company is doing this, and it might be okay, but you might not really want to share that. And I think that's happening, excuse me, a fair amount. Again, the evidence pack, we had pretty sophisticated model cards that we would develop for the models we reviewed. So at a glance, you could see that we had reviewed it, what was in it, the data, the discrimination impact, if there was any, the disparate treatment, everything that's going to be necessary. Consumer-facing templates, the service level agreements that can be, you know, in DMN and BPMN, the affirmative defense controls and mapping. You know, again, if you can go back to a regulated standard like the NIST AI and say, hey, we've mapped this all here, we've done all this, you should be happy. And then exception and override governance. So there's a lot of pieces to this, and it starts to, in my, or at least in my experience, map out pretty clearly when you know who needs to be involved, who needs to be a piece of the puzzle. The first thing I hear from a lot of companies is, for this stuff, well, we're just going to have, you know, a responsible AI board that'll meet once a quarter and look at stuff. I'm like, this is happening so fast, you cannot afford to do that. Meet once a month, take a look at exception cases that have showed up, but just stay in the loop, but not part of the active review and monitoring process. You know, so putting it all together, if we have something where we've got our model, where we monitor a model and we see now we've got a bias risk, well, we've got a fairness problem. Run the pipeline again, we might have to trigger the DMN to that we've got a disclosure clock on this one, and public statements that have to refresh, compile the evidence pack, report up to a board with it. So let DMN handle the clocks, triggers, deterministic gates, workflows, operation procedures, pipelines, everywhere else. And with that, you can probably pull things together in a reasonable fashion. I was thinking about why there was so much that was squishy with the AI regulations that have come out. And frankly, 3/4 of every one of them is focused on the required documentation. And the bottom line is that regulators don't yet understand AI. And then when they think they do, it's moved again. Like, okay, so we're talking machine learning. Fine. Oh, well, now we have this generative AI thing. Oh, now we got this agent thing. And they honestly don't know enough to know what they don't know. And it's a tricky and difficult situation. I had the pleasure of sitting on a panel at I think it's an annual conference for U.S. state attorney generals. Frankly, it's more like a boondoggle for all of them. This was in Sun Valley, Idaho, which is just beautiful. And there were sessions and panels constantly. The two that were far and away the most heavily attended, one was on crypto and the other was on AI, which is the one I was doing. And there were a lot of good questions, and it really is under that we've got to understand this and get a better feel for it. I worked with a public policy group out of Georgetown in DC that was literally putting together packages to brief policymakers. You know, here's the obligations of a company in fintech and where we see issues. You know, here is something all around just based on election security and AI. So it's a learning and evolving process. But I think, you know, it's not surprising. We're demons good at the hard edges. There's a lot of that in the FHA example we have. I think that will work. The AI regulations in this one, you need a lot more with it. The hybrid approaches are great for both of these. I think we can get compliance, transparency, and adaptability out of it. And I also believe firmly, since, you know, my two loves of recent with decision modeling with AI governance, that they are something that can really work hand in hand well in a lot of cases. There's a lot of good uses, a lot of good applications, and some great things that are going to come out of that. And that's something I will certainly keep exploring. to that end, the other interesting rabbit hole I started to go down was building an AI model that will take a regulation, and I started to make a set of potential features, labels, categories, whatever you want to call it. We can have 4 elements of a regulation, what that kind of is, and then give it a score from 1 to 5. Something that a 5 is hard, clear-cut, discrete. A 1 is extremely squishy, and then we've got some room in between. So for a category I call determinism, which is really an exactness of a condition. LTV is less than 97%, that's a 5. That's a very hard edge. Reasonable care, that's the other end of the spectrum. That's going to be a 1. And you can kind of go down. I have a feeling that ultimately this list I've got is going to end up being a lot longer, and it may be domain specific. But I had some really interesting results and fun in kind of getting this model to evolve, and first working on federal mortgage and fintech regulatory things like the FHA memo. Now I started to look at some of the AI bills and regulations and to take them apart in this way, because I think this can be not necessarily a requirements document, but a good way to start to position yourselves to, say, hey, what do we have to do? What can we build? What can we automate? How can we handle this? So it's been an extremely interesting bit of exploration that I did not anticipate. And, generative AI has been a wonderful help in doing that. So that's kind of where I've left this for now, and we'll hopefully go forward with it more. But I think that was it. So we probably, I'm sure, got a few minutes if anybody has any thoughts or questions here.
Hi, Brian.
Hi.
Good to hear from you.
Likewise.
I'm going to do something that I really can't believe I'm about to do, which is I'm going to channel Ron Ross. If he was here, he would be saying that a piece of legislation is actually a set of declarative statements that you can ask a lot of potential questions of, and that what you're doing when you build something in DMN is building something that makes decisions which are compliant with the legislation. But of course, there are many, many other questions you could have asked the legislation. So I just want to know what your response would be to him if he put that point. Do you think it's a real issue? Or do you think it's just we can build as many decisions as we want based on any piece of legislation?
I think it is an issue. I think the reason we had luck with some of these, like the CFPB HMDA reporting, is because that was a stipulation on an actual, you're sending this, reporting this data specifically to us in this way. So that had more of the concrete hard edge to it. Other ones, yeah, I mean, it just gets, there's a wide range of these. He's not wrong in that assessment, but I think there's a number of things across a spectrum for it. And, when we at Freddie Mac, we were writing all the rules, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae have this gigantic binder, their seller servicer guide. And there were fuzzy parts in it, but remember, that's what Freddie is writing and saying, we can stipulate our own rule here. We could go back to the business owners and say, so which do you mean here? Because that can't be fuzzy. We have to render a decision. So we had a lot of leeway with that, but that's not always the case.
Alan, Ron would probably add one more statement. He would say that if a human, a lawyer, can apply these regulations to a particular case, why your program cannot do the same?
Indeed, he would.
It's a
Rob will probably see a lot more scope for LLMs here than DMN.
Yeah, it's a valid question, and I think that well, in my mind, the invalid response is, well, we want to be able. I've got a number of attorney friends, and one of them used this expression that a cornered squirrel will disco, meaning, if we get trapped, we got to have some room to dance, and that's why some of that has been done. So yeah, I have a lot of interesting conversations with them, with attorneys. Generally, they kind of like this. The LLMs, they see benefit, but there's already been a number of cases or of situations where lawyers have filed briefs they wrote with ChatGPT that hallucinated citations, and so again, there's a big world to educate. I feel a lot for the law firms that do international work and have clients around the world that may be subject to any number of different regulations, and some of them are probably conflicting. So,
Brian, you clearly separated services that could be easily objects that cannot. And probably with this AI agents today, not necessarily created with Gen AI, but with regular symbolic AI, we can have, we don't need to implement everything. We can leave services that could be specifically implemented separately by a particular implementer, but the core services that could be easily implemented with DMN should be provided on the top. And one of the reasons for this is that usually I'm better familiar not with MISMA but with Accord for insurance industry. Usually Department of Insurance provides not only regulations, it usually gives people at least 3 examples that they should properly handle. If you cannot pass through this example, so your insurance policy is not valid. So when they provide these examples, and if they apply to the proper rules, to the proper partially implemented regulation, that's the way to go. So maybe you can consider this part, and especially concentration on service orchestration could be very helpful, and it will name exactly what this process is about, what this service is about, or let's call them AI agents, what should be the specification for this service, and we can use this modern discovery elements and probably MCP, what people discuss now, for implementation. Not just some thoughts.
yeah, we found one of the things we found, and I was kind of hoping, or I was wondering how it would be, but a BPMN model ended up being a very friendly way to show a lot of this to a wide variety of stakeholders at the company. And it was just sort of like, oh, I like seeing it this way. This makes sense. I get it. And so not only was it functional for us in that way, but it ended up being a very good communication method as well. So I think that orchestration, communication, and even the documentation from it, it's got benefits all around for these standards.
Yeah, that's important things that you can specify what this service should do. For example, service should check the proper present, the proper documents, and but without even implementing this service, you can have a specification of the service. Then you can look on 4 or 5 implementations, and maybe again. A government body can come up with something as an example and recommend other people to use something similar. So just you're not going right away to 100%, but I believe you listed probably 60-70% that could be implemented and it could be standardized.
Yeah, I think I don't question that number at all, but I think that would be a great way to go, because these are not going to stop anytime soon, and it's a very tedious, difficult assignment for any company to keep up with it, to understand it, to digest it, and figure out what to do about it. So,
okay, more questions? Do we have more questions? Okay. Okay.
Great.
That's the long day, Brian. Thank you very much. It's very interesting as usual, and this is a real world example of decision intelligence services. And this is probably good end of this day. And we're looking forward for you to present in the following years. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.